I would like to talk about the military-industrial complex because of its prevalence in the past and its relevance to us in the future. The military-industrial complex began to form during World War II, but was only given a title in 1961 by President Eisenhower in his farewell address. In his address, he said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. In the councils of government, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex, the potential for disastrous rise and misplaced power exists and will persist." Now, what is the military-industrial complex? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as an informal alliance of military and related government departments with defense industries that is held to influence government policy. In other words, it is a relationship between governments and their military with private defense corporations that influences how that governments make decisions. A website called the Military-Industrial Complex, which is devoted to monitoring defense contracts, defines it as an informal phrase to signify the comfortable relationship that can develop between government entities, namely defense, and defense-minded manufacturers or organizations. This diagram, that came from an article from the website Wall Street Window, depicts the military-industrial complex and is called the Iron Triangle. It depicts the relationship between our government, military, and private industry. It shows that as Congress sends funding and support to state officials being non-elected representatives within the government, they in turn award contracts and require low regulation to private defense industries. These private industries then provide funding to congressmen's campaigns, basically bribing them. It also goes in the other direction, where Congress overlooks questionable acts by private defense corporations. These corporations are then allowed to support favorable legislation, and politicians. This legislation is then supported within Congress by the politicians. As you can see, there's quite a bit of conflict of interest. A hypothetical example of how the military-industrial complex might work would go something like this. Congress would want 100 spy planes built, and they send this down the line to an official within the Air Force, and they decide which company gets the contract. The official ends up choosing, say, Lockheed Martin, because someone in Congress promised the official within the Air Force a promotion if they did so. And it doesn't matter if there's a different company that can do it just as well for cheaper. And this is due to the person in Congress who influenced the official in the Air Force being promised by Lockheed funding in their campaign. And this circle of conflict of interest keeps going around and is fueled by the need for military equipment. A big part of the industrial complex is no-bid contracts, also known as sole source contracts. A sole source contract is a contract given to a company that produces to a company for products that only it can produce. Now, this type of contract can be bad when Congress or state officials deliberately ask for a product with certain features that only one company can produce. These types of contracts are often awarded to companies because of how they influence state officials or politicians. For an example of how a no-bid contract might work, I'll use the same example as before with the spy planes. So Congress wants 100 spy planes, but they wanted to have a certain feature, like a cockpit that slides back instead of opening vertically, that only Lockheed produces. This no-bid contract is then awarded to Lockheed at a price they decide, costing taxpayers. Of course, this contract could have been awarded to either Boeing or Lockheed if it did not have pointless features. The two companies would then have competed for the contract if it didn't have these constraints, giving the taxpayers the best price. And like in the example before, Lockheed may have promised an official or politician funding so that they endorse the constraints within the contract. No-bid contracts may also be given to corporations without looking for the best price because of the same reasons. This chart, taken from an article written by Neil Gordon uses data from the Government Accountability Office, shows how many no-bid contracts were awarded in 2010 to 2012. Almost half the contracts given out by the DoD or Department of Defense from 2010 to 2012 were no-bid contracts. States gave out $1.4 billion in no-bid contracts, and the United States Agency for International Development gave out $3.3 billion in no-bid contracts. All contracts given out by the Department of Defense can be found on the website dod.gov. The military-industrial complex has had a long history and is especially prevalent during wars when the United States needs weapons and military equipment. This graph, created by Bruce Berkowitz, found on the Hoover Institute website, shows defense spending since 1908. It rose slightly during World War I and then went back down to pre-World War I levels until World War II, and then rose again during the Cold War. In President Eisenhower's farewell address, he recognized the need for a permanent armaments industry in light of the Cold War. And as you can see, the graph by the graph, the spending by the DoD stayed fairly constant and never returned to pre-World War II levels. Eisenhower also understood that the United States could no longer take the stance that they had held before World War II, of boosting the defense industry after the war had already broken out. This is because of how America was unprepared to go to war after Pearl Harbor was bombed. Since World War II, the military-industrial complex has been running strong and shows very little signs of stopping. Thank you.